Sometimes grief takes you to places you never imagined. When 67-year-old Thera Winscombe buried her husband, she buried her old life with him. The town of Millstone forgot about her, fast. But Thera didn't vanish, she just went into the woods. With her husband's old tools and her own 2 hands, she built a shelter under the roots of a fallen oak tree. People called it foolish. They called it sad. Then the wealthy Drennick family showed up at her door with a checkbook, ready to pay whatever it took. A widow living under a tree shouldn't have anything worth wanting, but they wanted it bad. What did Thera build that made the richest people in town beg to own it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thera Winscombe had been married for 40 years before Vernon's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in March. They were sitting at the breakfast table, same table they'd sat at for decades, when he reached for the cream pitcher and just stopped. His hand went to his chest, his eyes found hers, and in that moment she saw everything: apology, love, fear, and something else she couldn't name. He was gone before the ambulance made it up their gravel drive. The funeral was well attended. Vernon had been Millstone's blacksmith since before most folks could remember, and there wasn't a person in town who didn't own something he'd made. Iron railings, gate hinges, fireplace tools, decorative scrollwork, his hands had shaped half the town. People lined up to tell Thera how sorry they were, how much Vernon had meant to them, how he'd been a good man. She thanked them all. She accepted their casseroles and their sympathy cards. And when the last person left her house that evening, she sat in the silence and understood that she couldn't stay there. The house felt wrong without him. Not empty, that would have been easier. It felt full of Vernon in a way that made his absence unbearable. His coffee mug still sat by the sink, his reading glasses rested on the side table where he'd left them, his jacket hung by the door. Every object was a small knife, and Thera knew she had 2 choices: spend the rest of her days bleeding in that house, or leave. She chose to leave. Thera packed a rucksack with practical things: clothes, matches, a tin pot, canned goods, a wool blanket. She took Vernon's old forge tools from the workshop, a hand hammer, iron tongs, a box of stakes and nails he'd made himself over the years. She didn't have a plan exactly. She just knew she needed to be somewhere else, somewhere that didn't remind her of everything she'd lost. The woods north of Millstone were familiar territory. She and Vernon had hiked there in their younger years, back when the trails were clearer and their knees were stronger. The land was unclaimed forest, too rocky and steep for farming, too scattered for logging. Nobody owned it, and nobody wanted it. That suited Thera just fine. She found the fallen oak on her 3rd day of walking. It was massive, must have been 200 years old before the lightning took it down. The trunk was wider than she was tall, and when it fell, the root system had lifted up like a great wooden hand reaching for the sky. The roots created a natural cave beneath them, sheltered from wind and rain. Thera stood there looking at it and thought, this is the place. Building the shelter took 2 weeks. She was 67 years old and her joints complained, but she'd always been strong. Vernon used to joke that she had the arms of a woman half her age, from helping him in the forge. She used those arms now, digging out the earth beneath the roots to create more headroom, shoring up the sides with branches and stones. She drove Vernon's iron stakes into the ground to create a frame, stretched canvas over the top for waterproofing. She built a small fire pit just outside the entrance, positioned so the smoke would rise through the gaps in the root system and disperse among the branches above. It wasn't beautiful, but it was hers. More importantly, it was new. There were no memories of Vernon here except the ones she chose to bring with her. The people of Millstone didn't understand, but then Thera hadn't expected them to. News traveled fast in a small town, and within days everyone knew that Vernon's widow had lost her mind and gone to live in the woods like some kind of hermit. Some of the church ladies came looking for her that first week, concerned and clucking like worried hens. Thera met them at the tree line, thanked them for their concern, and sent them away. After that, the visits stopped. People talked for a while. She could imagine the conversations over coffee and at the grocery store, but eventually the talk died down. Life moved on, as it always does, and Thera Winscombe faded from the town's collective memory. She was content with that. Her days developed a rhythm that felt right in a way her life hadn't for months. She woke with the sun, tended her fire, boiled water for coffee. She foraged for wild greens and mushrooms, supplemented her diet with the canned goods she'd brought, and occasionally replenished on quiet trips to town. She read books by firelight and studied the woods around her. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke each morning without the crushing weight of grief that had defined her first months after Vernon's death. But it was Vernon's leather-bound journal that occupied most of her evenings. She'd found it in his workshop after the funeral, tucked away in a drawer she'd never had reason to open. The journal was old, the leather soft and worn from decades of handling. It contained Vernon's notes about forge techniques, sketches of ironwork designs, lists of supplies and clients. But scattered throughout were other entries, observations about land surveys, notes about property boundaries, references to his great-grandfather's work as a surveyor in the 1890 seconds. Thera had never paid much attention to Vernon's genealogy interests. He'd sometimes mention his ancestors, tell stories about the old days, but she'd assumed it was just the idle curiosity of a man getting older, looking back at where he came from. Now, reading through the journal by firelight in her shelter under the tree, she wondered if there had been more to it. One entry in particular caught her attention, dated about 2 years before Vernon's death. Checked the county records again today. Still can't find the transfer documents for great-grandfather's claim. Clerk said records from that era are incomplete. Fire in 1923. Destroyed some files. But something doesn't sit right. The land existed. William Tobias owned it. Where did it go? Thera ran her finger over Vernon's handwriting, feeling the slight indent in the paper where his pen had pressed. He'd been searching for something, investigating something. And then he'd died, and whatever he'd been looking for remained unfound. The town of Millstone sat in the valley between 2 ridges in the Appalachian foothills. It was small population, barely 2,000, but it had everything a community needed. A main street with a grocery store, hardware shop, diner, post office and library. A white-steepled church where most folks gathered on Sunday mornings. A volunteer fire department and a 2-man police force. Surrounding the town were scattered homesteads and farms, connected by narrow roads that wound through the hills. The Drennick family owned most of the productive land. They'd been in Millstone since the 1880 seconds, arriving during the same wave of settlement that brought Vernon's ancestors. Augustus Drennick had started a timber operation that grew over the generations into the largest business in the county. Drennick Timber employed half the men in town and leased land to most of the farmers. The family lived in a sprawling house on the hill overlooking Main Street, a literal and figurative position above everyone else. Thera had never had much to do with the Drennicks. Vernon's work as a blacksmith kept them comfortable but not wealthy, and they moved in different social circles. She'd seen Victoria Drennick at church over the years, always impeccably dressed, always seated in the 3rd pew on the right, like it was reserved for royalty. Randall Drennick, Victoria's oldest son, ran the timber business now. He was about 45, all business suits and firm handshakes, the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. The Drennicks represented everything about Millstone that Thera had never quite fit into the hierarchies, the unspoken rules about who mattered and who didn't. Vernon had bridged that gap better than she ever could. His craftsmanship was respected regardless of his bank account. But Thera had always been content to remain in the background, supporting her husband, tending her garden, living a quiet life. That life seemed impossibly distant now, separated from her present not just by Vernon's death, but by her own choice to walk away from it. Sitting in her shelter with the journal open on her lap, Thera felt the strange liberation of having nothing left to lose. No house to maintain, no social obligations to fulfill, no expectations to meet. Just her, the woods, and the question of what Vernon had been searching for. She was 3 weeks into her new life when she had her first visitor, who wasn't from the church committee. A young hunter, couldn't have been more than 20, stumbled across her shelter at dawn. He'd been tracking a deer and followed its trail to the oak tree. The look on his face when Thera emerged from beneath the roots was almost comical, like he'd encountered a wood sprite instead of a 67-year-old woman with dirt under her fingernails. "Ma'am," he stammered, lowering his rifle immediately. "I didn't know anyone was. I didn't think. You're on unclaimed land, same as me," Thera said, her voice rusty from days without conversation. "Your deer went north about 20 minutes ago. You'll find it if you're quick." The hunter nodded, still staring, then seemed to remember his manners. "You're Mrs. Winscombe, aren't you? The blacksmith's wife?" "Widow," Thera corrected gently. "Yes. Are you—" he hesitated. "Are you okay out here?" The question was kind, genuinely concerned. Thera offered him a small smile. "I'm better than I've been in months. Thank you for asking." He left, but Thera knew the encounter meant her solitude was about to end. By sunset, half of Millstone would know exactly where she was living. The thought bothered her less than she expected. Let them know. Let them think whatever they wanted. She was done caring about the opinions of people who would forget her as soon as the next piece of gossip came along. What she didn't anticipate was who would come looking for her next, or why. That would happen in the morning, when a black SUV pulled up to the tree line and Randall Drennick stepped out, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that suggested this was a business call, not a social one. Thera watched him approach from her position by the fire. She'd been boiling water for coffee, and she didn't stand or rush to greet him. This was her home now, such as it was, and she would receive visitors on her own terms. "Mrs. Winscombe," Randall said, stopping a respectful distance from the fire. His shoes were expensive, completely impractical for the woods. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Thera said, "but you're here anyway. What can I do for you, Mr. Drennick?" His smile was practiced, professional. "I heard you'd taken up residence out here. Quite the setup you've built." Thera poured her coffee and didn't offer him any. "It suits my needs." "I'm sure it does." Randall glanced around, his gaze taking in the shelter, the fire pit, the small garden plot she'd started. "The thing is, Mrs. Winscombe, this land is currently under review for development. The county is considering rezoning this entire area, and we, Drennick Timber, have submitted a proposal for a residential expansion project. This is unclaimed forest land," Thera said. "Has been for as long as anyone remembers." "That's true," Randall agreed. "But unclaimed doesn't mean it will stay that way forever. Progress comes to every community eventually. And given your current situation, I thought I should speak with you directly before the county makes any official decisions." Thera sipped her coffee and studied him over the rim of her cup. "You want me to leave?" "I want to make you an offer," Randall corrected smoothly. He opened his portfolio and pulled out a document. $50,000 for you to relocate and surrender any claim to this particular plot of land. That's more than generous, Mrs. Winscombe. You could buy a nice little house in town, live comfortably. I'm not interested in your money." The refusal seemed to surprise him. His practiced smile faltered for just a moment before returning. "Mrs. Winscombe, I understand you're going through a difficult time. Grief can make us do things that don't always make sense. But living out here isn't sustainable long-term. Winter's coming in a few months. I said I'm not interested." Thera set down her coffee cup and met his eyes directly. "This land doesn't belong to you or your family. It doesn't belong to anyone. I'm not hurting anything by being here, and I'm not leaving." Randall's expression shifted, the professional veneer cracking slightly to reveal something harder underneath. "Everything has an owner, Mrs. Winscombe. If not now, then soon. The county board is meeting next month to finalize the rezoning. Once that happens, any structures on this land will be considered illegal, and you'll be subject to eviction. Then I suppose I'll deal with that when it happens." They stared at each other across the fire pit, an old woman in work clothes and a wealthy man in a business suit, neither willing to yield. Finally, Randall tucked his document back into the portfolio. "You should think carefully about this," he said. "Squatters' rights won't protect you, and fighting the county in court is expensive. My offer stands for now, but it won't forever." He left without another word, picking his way carefully back to his SUV. Thera watched him go, and felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in her shelter until now: unease. Not fear, exactly, but a sense that something larger was moving beneath the surface of this conversation, something Randall hadn't said out loud. She picked up Vernon's journal again that evening and reread the entries about his great-grandfather's land claim. $50,000 was a lot of money, more than she and Vernon had saved in their entire marriage. Why would Randall Drennick offer that much for a patch of rocky forest with a crude shelter built under a fallen tree? Unless he knew something she didn't, unless this land was worth more than just dirt and roots. Thera turned to a page near the back of the journal where Vernon had sketched a rough map. It showed property lines and landmarks, with one section circled and labeled W.T. Winscombe, original claim 1891. The circle encompassed the area where she now sat. Her great-great-grandfather-in-law had owned this land. The claim had been filed, recorded, legal, and then, somehow, it had disappeared from the records. Vernon had been trying to trace what happened, trying to find the documents that would explain where the land had gone. Thera made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go into town. She would visit the library, maybe the courthouse. She would find out what Vernon had been searching for, and she would understand why Randall Drennick was so eager to pay her to leave. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks drifting up through the root system into the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Thera wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and felt, for the first time since Vernon's death, a sense of purpose beginning to kindle in her chest. Whatever secrets this land held, she was going to uncover them. Thera woke before dawn the next morning with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in months. She heated water for washing, changed into her cleanest clothes, and packed Vernon's journal carefully into a canvas bag along with the hand-drawn map. The walk into Millstone took about an hour, following an old deer trail that eventually connected to a logging road. The town looked different to her now, or maybe she was different. The familiar storefronts and houses seemed smaller somehow, less significant. She'd spent 40 years as part of this community, and in just 3 weeks of absence she'd become a stranger to it. People gave her curious looks as she walked down Main Street. Mrs. Kelso from the grocery store actually stopped sweeping her front step to stare. Thera nodded politely and kept walking. The Millstone County Library was a small brick building wedged between the post office and a tax preparation service. Phyllis Kemper had been the librarian for as long as Thera could remember, a thin, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who knew where every book belonged and could recommend titles with uncanny accuracy. She looked up when Thera entered, and her expression shifted from surprise to something warmer. "Thera Winscombe," Phyllis said, coming around the desk. "I heard you'd well. I heard various things. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Phyllis. Better than I've been, actually." Thera set her bag on the desk. "I need your help with some research. Historical records, land claims from the 1892. Phyllis's eyebrows rose with interest. "That's quite specific. What are you looking for?" Thera pulled out Vernon's journal and opened it to the map. "My husband's great-grandfather, William Tobias Winscombe, filed a land claim in 1891. Vernon had been trying to trace what happened to it before he died. I'd like to continue his research. Vernon was in here several times over the past couple of years," Phyllis said thoughtfully. always looking at old property records and survey maps. He never said exactly what he was searching for, but I got the sense it mattered to him. She studied the hand-drawn map. "This location, is this where you've been staying?" "It is." Something passed across Phyllis's face, understanding, perhaps, or concern. "Come with me," she said. "The historical records are in the back room." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of dusty ledgers and faded documents. Phyllis helped Thera navigate the filing system, such as it was. The county's record-keeping from the late 1800s was haphazard at best. Many documents had been damaged in a courthouse fire in 1923. Others had simply been misfiled or lost over the years. But they found what they were looking for in a leather-bound ledger dated 1891. There, in careful handwriting, was the entry: William Tobias Winscombe, 40 acres, Ridge Creek watershed, claim filed the 15th of April, 1891. The legal description matched the area where Thera's shelter now stood. "So he did own it," Thera murmured, tracing the entry with her finger. "The claim was filed properly," Phyllis agreed. She turned pages, following the record forward through the years. "Here it is in 1895, taxes paid, 1,900, taxes paid, 1,905, 1,910, 1,915, all current." She paused. And then in 1918 the record just stops. Thera leaned closer. The entry for 1,918 showed taxes paid, same as previous years. But 1,919 and beyond, nothing. No sale record, no transfer of ownership, no indication that the property had been seized for unpaid taxes. The land simply disappeared from the official record. "That's not normal," Phyllis said. "Even if the land had been sold or transferred, there should be documentation. And if William Tobias had died, there should be probate records, inheritance paperwork, something." "What if someone wanted the land to disappear?" Thera asked quietly. Phyllis met her eyes. "Then you'd need someone with access to the records, someone with influence." She closed the ledger carefully. "The Drennick family has been involved in county government since the 1882nd. Augustus Drennick served on the county board from 1910 until his death in 1932. The pieces were starting to fit together in Thera's mind, forming a picture she didn't like. "Randall Drennick came to see me yesterday, offered me $50,000 to leave the land where I'm staying." Phyllis's expression sharpened. "50,000? For unclaimed forest land? That's what I thought. Too much money for what it appears to be." Thera gathered the journal and map. "I need to see the courthouse records, the originals, not just what's been copied here." "The county clerk's office has the deed, records," Phyllis said. "But Thera, be careful. If the Drennicks are involved in this, they won't like you asking questions." "I'm a 67-year-old widow, living under a tree," Thera said with a slight smile. "How much trouble can I cause?" Phyllis didn't smile back. "More than you might think. Vernon knew something, or was close to finding something. And now you're following the same trail." The unspoken implication hung between them. Vernon was dead. His heart attack had been sudden, unexpected. The doctors said these things happened, especially to men his age. But what if there had been more to it? What if Vernon's research had made someone nervous? Thera shook off the thought. She was letting her imagination run away with her. Vernon had died of natural causes. The coroner had confirmed it. There was no conspiracy, no foul play, just an old man whose heart gave out. Still, as she left the library and walked toward the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something larger than a simple property dispute. The morning sun felt too bright, the air too still. Every person she passed seemed to watch her a moment too long. The courthouse was a 3-story stone building at the end of Main Street, imposing in a way that suggested permanence and authority. Thera climbed the front steps and pushed through the heavy doors into the cool, echoing interior. A directory board pointed her to the county clerk's office on the second floor. The clerk on duty was a young man, maybe in his early 30s, with dark-rimmed glasses and a name tag that read, Morris Lent. He looked up from his computer when Thera approached the counter, and his expression was friendly, open. "Can I help you?" "I need to examine property records from the 1,890 seconds through the 1,920 seconds, Thera said. "Specifically, deed transfers and ownership records for land in the Ridge Creek watershed." Morris nodded. "That'll be in the archive. Fair warning, it's not digitized, so you'll need to go through physical documents. Could take some time." "I have time." He led her to a back room lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes. The smell of old paper and dust filled the air. Morris pulled out several boxes and set them on a large table. "These should cover what you're looking for," he said. "If you need anything, just let me know. I'll be at the front desk." Thera thanked him and began her search. The documents were organized by year and then by property description. She worked methodically, checking each year from 1891 forward. The original land patent for William Tobias Winscombe was there, beautifully preserved, a formal document with an official seal, granting him 40 acres in perpetuity. She traced the ownership through the years, cross-referencing with the ledger entries she'd seen at the library. Everything matched perfectly until 1918. And then, like Phyllis had said, nothing. The trail went cold, but as she dug deeper, checking, surrounding properties and cross-referencing names, she found something interesting. In 1920, a large parcel of land adjacent to William Tobias's claim had been transferred to Drennick timber. The legal description placed it immediately west of the Winscombe property. In 1922, another parcel to the east also transferred to Drennick timber. By 1925, the Drennicks owned everything surrounding the Winscombe claim. Everything except the claim itself. Thera sat back, her mind working through the implications. The Drennicks had systematically acquired all the land around William Tobias's property, creating a situation where his 40 acres would be landlocked, inaccessible except by crossing Drennick land. It was a classic strategy for forcing a sale: isolate the property, make it useless to the owner, then buy it cheap when they gave up. But according to the records, that sale never happened. William Tobias never sold. The land just vanished from the official record, and the Drennicks went on to develop everything around it. Morris appeared in the doorway. "Finding what you need." "I'm finding questions," Thera said. "Do you have records of private settlements or agreements, something that wouldn't be in the main deed files?" Morris frowned thoughtfully. "There's a separate filing system for adjudicated disputes and private settlements." "Let me check." He returned 15 minutes later with a puzzled expression. "There's a notation in the index from 1919. It references a Drennick Winscombe settlement, file number 472. But when I went to pull the file, it's missing. The checkout card says it was removed in 1962 and never returned." "Who checked it out?" "There's no name, just an authorization code. I'd need to cross-reference that with the old personnel records, and those are—" He hesitated. "Those are stored off-site. Would take a formal request to access them." Thera could see the bureaucratic walls going up. Some records were more protected than others, especially if they involved prominent families. "Is there any other way to find out what was in that file?" Morris glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, files don't just go missing by accident. If someone wanted that settlement buried, they had 60 years to make sure it stayed buried." He paused. "What's your interest in this, if you don't mind me asking?" "The land in question is where I'm currently living," Thera said, "and the Drennicks have made it very clear they want me gone." Understanding dawned in Morris's eyes. "You're the woman living in the woods. I heard about that." He was quiet for a moment, weighing something. My grandmother lost her farm to Drennick timber in the 1970 seconds. They bought up the note when the bank foreclosed, paid pennies on the dollar. She died thinking she'd failed, but I always wondered if they'd engineered the situation. He straightened. I can't officially help you dig into sealed records, but if you need copies of a board, anything in these boxes, I'm happy to assist. Thera spent another hour making careful notes and, with Morris's help, getting copies of the key documents, the original land patent, the surrounding property transfers, and the index notation about the missing settlement file. When she finally left the courthouse, the sun was past its zenith, and her feet ached, but she had something concrete. Proof that William Tobias Winscombe had legally owned the land, and proof that the ownership record had been deliberately obscured. She stopped at the diner for a late lunch, sitting in a corner booth with coffee and a sandwich she barely tasted. Her mind was elsewhere, piecing together a story that had started more than a century ago. William Tobias had owned valuable land. The Drennicks had wanted it. Somehow, they'd made the ownership record disappear, and the land had become unclaimed. Except it wasn't unclaimed. It had an owner, or rather, it had heirs. Vernon's family line, continuing down to Vernon himself, and now to her. Thera was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the woman approaching her booth until a cultured voice said, "Mrs. Winscombe, may I join you?" She looked up to find Victoria Drennick standing beside her table, elegant in a cream-colored suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. The matriarch of the Drennick family didn't wait for an answer. She slid into the opposite side of the booth with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "I understand my son visited you yesterday," Victoria said. "I apologize if he was heavy-handed. Randall sometimes forgets that business should be conducted with courtesy." "He was clear enough," Thera said evenly. Victoria's smile was slight, knowing, "I'm sure he was. But perhaps you and I can have a more productive conversation, woman to woman." She folded her hands on the table. "Your husband knew things he never shared, didn't he? About the land, about the past. He was asking questions, much like you're doing now." The statement sent a chill through Thera. "You knew Vernon was researching his family's property?" "I make it my business to know what happens in this town," Victoria said, "especially when it concerns my family's interests. Vernon was a good man, Mrs. Winscombe. A skilled craftsman, well respected. It's a shame he didn't live long enough to finish whatever he started." The words were sympathetic, but there was something underneath them, a warning, subtle but unmistakable. Thera met Victoria's gaze directly. "What exactly are you trying to tell me?" "I'm telling you that some inheritances carry debts," Victoria said. "Old debts, from old mistakes. The past is complicated, Mrs. Winscombe. Digging into it rarely leads anywhere good." She stood, smoothing her suit jacket. "My son's offer stands. $50,000 to walk away. Think about it. Winter's coming, and the woods are no place for a woman your age." She left before Thera could respond, moving through the diner with the same confident grace she'd entered. Thera sat alone in the booth, her sandwich forgotten, Vernon's journal heavy in her bag. Victoria Drennick had just confirmed everything Thera suspected. The land mattered. The history mattered. And the Drennicks were worried enough about what Thera might find to send both Randall and Victoria to pressure her. That worry, Thera realized, was her leverage. She didn't know the full story yet, didn't understand what made this particular patch of land so valuable. But she knew one thing for certain: she was going to find out. And she was not going to walk away. The walk back to her shelter felt longer than usual. Thera's mind churned with Victoria's words, with the missing file, with all the pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite see completely. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Normally, this walk brought her peace. Today, it brought only questions. She emerged from the tree line near her shelter and stopped cold. Something was wrong. The fire pit looked undisturbed. Her canvas covering was still in place, but there was a wrongness to the scene that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Then she saw a small wooden stake driven into the ground about 10 feet from her fire pit. It was new, the wood still pale and unseasoned, and burned into its surface was a logo, Drennick Timber. Someone had been here while she was in town. Someone had marked her land. Thera circled the shelter slowly, checking for other signs of intrusion. Her few possessions seemed untouched. The tin pot was where she'd left it. Her spare clothes were still folded in their plastic bin. But the presence of that stake felt like a violation, a message written in wood. "We know where you are, and we can come any time we want." She pulled the stake from the ground and threw it into the fire pit. It could stay there until she built tonight's fire and burned it. For now, she needed to think. Inside the shelter, she spread out her copied documents on the dirt floor and studied them by the fading daylight. The land patent, the property transfers, the mysterious missing settlement file. They told a story, but not the whole story. What was she missing? Vernon's journal lay beside the documents. She picked it up and flipped through it again, reading more carefully this time, looking for anything she might have overlooked. Most of the entries were mundane notes about ironwork orders, sketches of gate designs, observations about the weather. But scattered throughout were Vernon's research notes, and as she read them in order, she began to see the progression of his investigation. 2 years ago, her dad mentioned great-grandfather William Tobias again today, said he was a surveyor and prospector. Never found much, but he kept looking. Reminds me of myself in the forge, trying one more technique, hoping for that perfect piece. 18 months ago, been thinking about William Tobias's land claim. Dad said it was somewhere north of town, never developed. Wonder what happened to it. 1 year ago, checked county records, found William Tobias's original claim 40 acres, Ridge Creek watershed, no record of sale or transfer after 1918. How does land just disappear from the books? 6 months ago, something's not right about this. The Drennicks own everything around William Tobias's claim. Everything. But they don't own his 40 acres. At least not according to legal record. Need to dig deeper. 3 months before Vernon died, found reference to a settlement between Augustus Drennick and William Tobias in 1919. File is missing from courthouse. Phyllis at library helping me research. There's a story here. I can feel it. 1 month before Vernon died. Talked to old Harvey Trent at the hardware store. He's 89, remembers stories his grandfather told. Said William Tobias Winscombe fell from a ridge in 1919. Everyone said it was an accident, but his grandfather always wondered. Said William Tobias was too experienced a surveyor to fall like that. Said he'd been having trouble with Augustus Drennick over some business deal gone bad. And then, the final entry, written the day before Vernon's heart attack. Tomorrow, I'm going to the Drennick house. Time to ask Victoria face to face what happened to William Tobias's land. She's old enough to remember the stories her father-in-law would have told. If anyone knows the truth, it's her. Thera thinks I'm obsessing over nothing, and maybe I am. But this land belonged to my family. It should still belong to my family. I need to understand what happened. Thera's hands trembled as she read the last entry. Vernon had gone to confront the Drennicks, and that night he'd had a fatal heart attack. The doctors had said it was natural causes, blocked arteries, age, stress. But what if there had been more to it? What if that confrontation had triggered something? She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, feeling the weight of grief and suspicion mixing together in a way that made her throat tight. Vernon had been investigating this mystery. He'd gotten close to something, and then he'd died. No, she couldn't let herself think that way. Vernon's death was natural. It had to be. The alternative was too terrible to consider. But even as she tried to dismiss the thought, it lingered, and mixed with it was a new resolve. Whatever Vernon had been trying to uncover, she would finish it. For him, for his memory, for the truth. As evening settled over the woods, Thera heard footsteps approaching. She tensed, reaching for Vernon's hammer, the only thing resembling a weapon she had. But the voice that called out was familiar and friendly. "Thera, it's Lucille. Can I come closer?" Thera relaxed and stepped out from the shelter. Lucille Brenner was making her way carefully through the underbrush, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was 68, round-faced and perpetually cheerful, the kind of woman who showed love through food and fussing over people. "I brought you some dinner," Lucille said, slightly out of breath from the walk. "And some supplies. Don't argue, I know you can take care of yourself, but there's no shame in accepting help from a friend." Thera accepted the basket with genuine gratitude. Inside were fresh rolls, a container of stew, apples, and a jar of Lucille's homemade preserves. "Thank you. This is kind. It's nothing." Lucille looked around at the shelter with open curiosity. "So this is where you've been. I have to say, Thera, it's better than I expected. You always were resourceful." They sat by the unlit fire pit, and Lucille caught Thera up on town gossip, who was sick, who was getting married, who was feuding with whom over property lines. It was the comfortable conversation of old friends, and Thera realized how much she'd missed simple human connection. Eventually, though, Lucille's expression grew more serious. "There's talk in town," she said carefully, "about you and the Drennicks. People are saying Randall wants this land for some development project." "He does," Thera confirmed. "He offered me money to leave. Are you going to take it?" "No." Lucille studied her for a long moment. "This is about more than just the land, isn't it? This is about Vernon." Thera hadn't intended to share what she'd learned, but the words came anyway. She told Lucille about Vernon's research, about the missing property records, about William Tobias Winscombe's land claim that had mysteriously disappeared. She told her about Vernon's final journal entry, about his plan to confront the Drennicks the day before he died. When she finished, Lucille was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My husband Harold worked for Drennick Timber in the 80s. He's gone now, been 10 years. But I remember him coming home one night. He'd been having drinks with some of the older workers, men who'd been with the company since the 50s. They got to talking about the old days, and one of them mentioned something about Winscombe silver. Harold asked what they meant, and they laughed it off. Said it was just a local legend, something people used to talk about back in the day." "Silver?" Thera leaned forward. "What kind of silver? Mining, I think? There were small silver deposits found in these hills back in the 1892 and early 1900s. Nothing major, most of the mines played out quick. But according to the story Harold heard, William Tobias Winscombe supposedly found a vein that was better than most. Him and Augustus Drennick were partners, planning to develop it together. But then something went wrong between them. The partnership fell apart, and William Tobias ended up dead. After that, nobody could find the mine entrance. Some folks thought it was just legend. Others figured the Drennicks had covered it up and were working it secretly. The pieces clicked into place with sudden, startling clarity. Not just land, not just property rights, mineral rights, silver. That's what this was about. That's why the Drennicks wanted her gone so badly. That's what William Tobias had owned and what Augustus Drennick had wanted. The land itself might be rough and rocky, unsuitable for farming or building. But underneath could be something valuable. "Lucille," Thera said slowly, "does anyone still remember where the old mining sites were? Are there maps?" "Not that I know of. The small operations from that era weren't always documented well. And if William Tobias kept his mine location secret, it might have died with him." Lucille gathered up her empty basket. "Thera, be careful. If there's truth to this, if there really is silver under this land, the Drennicks won't let you just walk away with it. They've been powerful in this county for too long." After Lucille left, Thera sat in the gathering darkness and thought about silver veins and hidden mines and a century-old murder that everyone called an accident. She thought about Vernon, following the same trail of questions, getting close to the same answers. And she thought about the surveyor's stake someone had driven into her land today, marking it like prey. They were watching her, waiting to see what she would do. And somewhere in Vernon's journal or William Tobias's old claim or the pattern of those missing records was the key to understanding exactly what was at stake. Tomorrow she would keep digging, but tonight she would build her fire a little bigger, and she would sleep a little lighter, and she would trust her instincts that told her she was in deeper than she'd realized. The woods were quiet around her, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like held breath. Like the forest itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Thera didn't sleep well that night. Every sound in the woods seemed amplified, branches creaking, animals rustling through the underbrush, the wind moving through the canopy overhead. She kept thinking about Vernon's final journal entry, about his plan to confront Victoria Drennick. Had he gone through with it? Had that conversation somehow contributed to his heart attack? The doctors had been clear. Vernon's arteries were severely blocked. It was a medical certainty, they'd said, that he would have had a heart attack sooner or later. The stress and exertion of daily life was enough. But Thera couldn't shake the image of Vernon walking into the Drennick house, asking hard questions about century-old crimes, and then collapsing hours later. She rose before dawn and went through her morning routine mechanically, rebuilding the fire, boiling water, washing her face in the cold stream nearby. As she moved, she kept returning to Vernon's belongings scattered around the shelter. His forge hammer, his leather work gloves, the old canvas rucksack he'd used for hiking. And then she noticed something she'd overlooked before, a small oilcloth bundle tucked into the bottom of the rucksack. Her hands were steady as she unwrapped it. Inside was a brass compass, beautifully made, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. The lid was engraved with initials WT, W to VW, find true north. William Tobias Winscombe to Vernon Winscombe, great-great-grandfather to great-great-grandson. This compass had been passed down through 4 generations of Vernon's family. He'd never shown it to her before. She'd had no idea it existed. Why had he kept it hidden? And why had he brought it with him to their house, as if he'd been preparing to use it? Thera opened the compass. The needle swung and settled, pointing north. The mechanism still worked perfectly despite its age. On the inside of the lid was another engraving, smaller, harder to read. What's mine stays mine. The same words carved into the cornerstone she'd found beneath her shelter. This compass was more than an heirloom, it was a message, a declaration. William Tobias had meant for his descendants to find something, to claim something, and Vernon had been trying to follow that trail when he died. The memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and painful. Vernon in the hospital bed, the morphine making him drift between consciousness and confusion. She'd been holding his hand, and he'd gripped her fingers with surprising strength. "The land," he'd whispered. "Thera, the land, it's ours." "What's owed?" "Shh," she'd said, stroking his forehead. "Don't worry about that now. Just rest. Listen," he'd insisted, his eyes trying to focus on her face. "William Tobias, the compass. Find true north. What's owed to us?" But then the nurse had come in, adjusting his medication, and Vernon had slipped back into unconsciousness. He'd never woken fully enough to finish the thought. Thera had assumed it was just the morphine talking, old memories and family stories mixing with present confusion. Now she understood. Vernon had been trying to tell her something important, something about the land, about William Tobias's compass, about following it north to find what was owed to them. She held the compass in both hands, feeling its weight, its history. If William Tobias had used this compass in his surveying work, if he'd marked something important with it, then maybe the compass could lead her to whatever he'd hidden. But she couldn't search the woods on her own, not properly. She needed help. And more than that, she needed legal protection. The Drennicks were closing in, and she had to establish her claim before they found a way to force her off this land entirely. The decision was made. She would go back into town today. She would find someone who could help her navigate the legal system, someone who understood property law and mineral rights. And she would be careful, because if Vernon's death had taught her anything, it was that this situation was more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. She was packing the compass and journal back into her bag when she heard a vehicle approaching, not from the logging road this time, but from the main county road that ran closer to town. It was still early, barely past 7 o'clock. Who would be coming out here at this hour? Thera stepped out of the shelter as a sheriff's cruiser came into view, bouncing over the rough terrain. Sheriff Dale Pritchard climbed out, adjusting his hat. He was in his mid-50s, a career lawman with the weathered face of someone who'd seen plenty but remained fundamentally decent. Thera had known him for years. He and Vernon used to fish together occasionally. "Morning, Thera," he said, his tone apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you so early." "What's this about, Dale?" He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I got a complaint filed yesterday afternoon. Drennick Timber is claiming you're occupying disputed land without authorization. They're asking me to issue a formal trespass warning." "This is unclaimed forest land," Thera said, keeping her voice level. "I'm not trespassing on anyone's property." I know. Dale held up his hands. "And personally, I don't want to be involved in this. But the county board is putting pressure on my office. They're saying the land is under review for development and any unauthorized habitation needs to be cleared." He pulled a folded document from his pocket. "This is the official warning. I'm required to serve it to you. It gives you 7 days to vacate voluntarily before we can proceed with forced removal." Thera took the document, but didn't open it. "Vernon's great-great-grandfather owned this land legally, Dale. 40 acres, properly claimed and recorded in 1891. Someone made those records disappear, but the claim was real. This land belongs to Vernon's family, which means it belongs to me." Dale's expression shifted to surprise. "You have proof of that?" "I have the original land patent. I have records showing continuous ownership through 1918, and then a suspicious gap where documents went missing. I have evidence that the Drennicks systematically bought up all the surrounding land, but couldn't get this 40 acres. She met his eyes. "And I have reason to believe Vernon died trying to reclaim what was stolen from his family." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thera, if what you're saying is true, you need a lawyer. A good one. And you need to file your claim officially before this trespass warning becomes an eviction order." He glanced back at his cruiser. "I can give you the full 7 days. I won't rush the process. But I can't protect you beyond that. The Drennicks have the county commissioner in their pocket, and he's making it clear he wants this resolved quickly." "Who's the commissioner these days?" "Richard Vance. His family and the Drennicks go back generations. They're country club friends, business associates." Dale's voice dropped. "Look, I'm not supposed to say this, but I don't like how this whole thing smells. If you've got a legitimate claim to this land, fight for it. But do it smart, get legal representation, file the proper paperwork, make everything official. Don't give them any excuse to remove you by force." "I appreciate the warning," Thera said, "and the advice." After Dale left, Thera sat down heavily on a log near her fire pit. 7 days. She had 7 days to establish her legal right to this land or be forcibly removed. The timeline had just become much more urgent. She packed her essentials into Vernon's rucksack, the journal, the compass, the copied documents from the courthouse, and a change of clothes. She would go to town now, find a lawyer, and start the formal process of reclaiming her family's property. But first, there was something she needed to check. Using the compass, Thera oriented herself north from the cornerstone she'd uncovered. William Tobias's message had been clear. Find true north. What's mine stays mine. If he'd hidden something, a mine entrance, documents, anything, the compass would point her to it. She walked slowly, keeping the compass needle aligned, watching the ground for any signs of human disturbance from a century ago. The forest had reclaimed most traces of the past, but some things endured. rock formations, unusual clearings, changes in the terrain that suggested deliberate work. 20 minutes north of her shelter, Thera found it. A rocky outcropping that looked natural at first glance, but showed signs of old toolwork on closer inspection. The rocks had been moved, stacked deliberately to form what might have been a retaining wall or the entrance to something larger. Vegetation covered most of it, and time had eroded the details, but the pattern was unmistakable to someone looking for it. This was it. This was what William Tobias had wanted his descendants to find. A mine entrance, sealed up and hidden but still there, waiting to be rediscovered. Thera didn't try to excavate it, not yet. That would require time and tools she didn't have. But she marked the location carefully in her mind, noted the landmarks, and then returned to her shelter to gather her things. She had found what Vernon had been searching for. Now she needed to protect it, claim it, and make sure the Drennicks couldn't take it away again. As she walked toward town, the brass compass heavy in her pocket, Thera felt Vernon's presence beside her. He'd started this journey. She would finish it. For him, for William Tobias, for every Winscombe who'd been cheated out of what was rightfully theirs. The Drennicks had stolen once. They wouldn't be allowed to steal again. The county courthouse was busier than Thera's last visit. It was a Wednesday morning, and people moved through the marble-floored hallways, with purpose lawyers with briefcases, clerks carrying files, citizens navigating the bureaucracy of local government. Thera felt out of place in her practical clothes, still carrying traces of wood, smoke, and forest living. But she held her head high and made her way to the records office. Maurice Lent looked up from his computer and smiled when he saw her. "Mrs. Winscombe, back again? And I need to see the original deed records again, all of them, including any index references to sealed or private files." Maurice's expression grew serious. "You found something." "I found several things." Thera pulled out her folder of documents. The original land patent, William Tobias Winscombe's ownership through 1918, and proof that someone deliberately removed records to make it look like the property was abandoned. They worked together for the next 2 hours, Maurice navigating the filing system while Thera documented everything. The original patent was clear and legally binding, 40 acres granted to William Tobias Winscombe by the federal government in 1891. The legal description matched the location where Thera's shelter stood, down to the specific landmarks and survey markers. "This is solid," Maurice said, studying the documents. "The land was never sold, never transferred, never seized for taxes. According to these records, it should still belong to William Tobias's heirs." He looked up at Thera. "That would be you, through Vernon. Can I file a claim based on this? You can file a petition to establish heirship and reclaim the property. It'll require proving your connection to William Tobias' marriage certificate to Vernon, Vernon's birth certificate and family records tracing back to William Tobias. Do you have those?" Thera nodded. She'd brought Vernon's family Bible, which contained the genealogical records going back generations. The Winscombes had been meticulous about documenting their lineage, perhaps knowing that someday these records would matter. Maurice helped her fill out the necessary forms. As they worked, he said quietly, "You should know this is going to make waves. The Drennicks won't take it well." "I know. And you'll need a lawyer. The county can assign a public defender, but for something this complicated, I need someone good." Thera finished. "Someone who understands property law and isn't afraid of the Drennicks." Maurice was quiet for a moment, then said, "My uncle is a property attorney. James Kemper, he practices in the state capital, about 2 hours from here. He specializes in mineral rights and land disputes. He's handled cases against big timber companies before." He wrote down a phone number. "Tell him I sent you. He owes me a favor. I helped him track down records for a case last year." "Thank you, Maurice, for everything. My grandmother died thinking she'd lost her farm through her own failure," Maurice said. "If the Drennicks engineered that situation like I suspect, then I want to see them held accountable. Consider this My small contribution to justice. Thera left the courthouse with her filed claim and James Kemper's phone number. She found a payphone outside the library and made the call, expecting to leave a message. Instead, Kemper answered directly. She explained the situation, the land claim, Vernon's research, the missing records, the Drennick's attempts to force her off the property. Kemper listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was silent for a moment. "How soon can you get to my office?" he asked. "I want to see these documents in person. I can be there by early afternoon. Come today. Bring everything, the original papers, your family records, any correspondence you've had with the Drennicks. This is the kind of case I've been waiting for." The drive to the capital took Thera through winding mountain roads and eventually to the flatter terrain where the city sprawled. She'd borrowed Lucille's car, promising to return it by evening. James Kemper's office was in a modest building near the courthouse, his name on a brass plaque beside two other attorneys who apparently shared the space. Kemper himself was in his mid-40s, lean and intense, with the kind of focused energy that suggested he threw himself completely into his work. He cleared his desk and spent an hour examining Thera's documents, asking precise questions, taking notes. Finally, he sat back. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases of land theft I've ever seen. The original patent is unimpeachable federal grant, properly filed, legally sound. The ownership records through 1918 establish continuous claim, and then the records just stop, with no legal justification." He tapped the page where the 1919 settlement file was noted as missing. This missing file is the smoking gun. Someone removed it deliberately to bury evidence of what really happened. "Can we win?" Thera asked. "If the documents are authentic, and they appear to be, then yes, the law is on your side. But understand, this won't be quick or easy. The Drennicks will fight hard. They'll challenge the documents, question your standing as heir, drag this through every possible appeal. We're looking at months, possibly years." "I don't have years," Thera said. "The sheriff gave me 7 days to vacate the land. After that, they can forcibly remove me." Kemper's jaw tightened. "Then we'll file for an emergency injunction. If there's a legitimate ownership dispute, the court has to preserve the status quo until it's resolved. That means they can't remove you while the case is pending." He started drafting documents immediately. "We'll need to appear before a judge tomorrow. Can you stay overnight in the city?" "I'll manage." They worked together until late in the evening, preparing the injunction request and the formal property claim. Kemper explained the strategy. Establish that Thera had a legitimate claim to ownership, show that the Drennick's actions were based on false premises, and argue that removing her before the dispute was resolved would cause irreparable harm to her rights. "There's something else," Thera said as they were finishing. "I found what might be an old mine entrance on the property, about 20 minutes north of my shelter. If there's silver under that land, if that's what William Tobias found and what Augustus Drennick wanted, then the mineral rights are part of the claim." Kemper's expression sharpened. "That changes everything. Mineral rights in this state can be worth substantial money. If we can prove there's a viable mineral deposit, the Drennick's motivation becomes much clearer and much more damning." He made another note. "We'll need a geological survey eventually, but for now, the possibility strengthens our case." Thera spent the night in a cheap motel, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed, thinking about the hearing tomorrow. So much depended on convincing a judge that her claim was legitimate, that she deserved protection under the law. She thought about Vernon, about how close he'd come to this same moment. Had he known he was running out of time? Had he sensed that his investigation was dangerous? In the morning, she met Kemper at the courthouse. The hearing was in a small courtroom, informal and quick. The judge was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Holbrook, known for being fair but exacting. Kemper presented their case efficiently, the land patent, the ownership records, the suspicious gap, and the sheriff's trespass warning. The county's attorney argued that the land had been considered abandoned for decades, that Thera was simply squatting on public forest land. But when Kemper produced the original patent and the documented ownership through 1918, the county attorney faltered. Judge Holbrook examined the documents carefully. This is clearly a disputed claim that requires full examination. Until this court determines the rightful ownership, the petitioner cannot be removed from the property. She looked at Thera. Mrs. Winscombe, you're granted a temporary injunction. No eviction proceedings can move forward while this case is pending. We'll set a full hearing for... She checked her calendar. 60 days from today. That gives both sides time to prepare their cases thoroughly. Thera felt relief wash through her. 60 days. She had 60 days of protection, 60 days to build her case and uncover the full truth. Outside the courtroom, Kemper shook her hand. This is just the first step. The Drennicks will come back hard at the full hearing. We need to find that missing settlement file, or find witnesses who remember what really happened. And we need to document that mine entrance photographs, geological assessment if possible. I'll do whatever it takes, Thera said. As she drove back to Millstone that afternoon, she felt Vernon's compass in her pocket, warm from her body heat. She'd won a battle, but the war was just beginning. The Drennicks now knew she was serious, that she had legal representation, that she wasn't going to simply disappear into the woods and be forgotten. They would escalate. She was certain of that. But so would she. The sun was setting when she returned Lucille's car and walked back to her shelter. The woods felt different now, not just a refuge from grief, but a battlefield where a century-old wrong would finally be addressed. The fallen oak tree sheltered her, its massive root system like protective arms. William Tobias had claimed this land, Vernon had fought to reclaim it, and now Thera would finish what they'd started. She built her fire larger than usual that night, letting the flames push back the darkness. Somewhere in town, the Drennicks were learning about the injunction, about her legal claim, about the fact that their careful plans to acquire this land had hit an unexpected obstacle. Let them know. Let them understand that Thera Winscombe was not a helpless widow to be pushed aside. She was the heir to William Tobias's claim, the keeper of Vernon's memory, and she would not yield. The fire crackled and sparks rose into the night sky. Thera wrapped herself in her blanket and felt, for the first time since Vernon's death, like she was exactly where she was meant to be, fighting for something that mattered, honoring the past while building toward a future that would finally deliver justice. The next morning, Thera woke with a sense of purpose that had become familiar over the past weeks. The injunction had bought her time, but time alone wouldn't win her case. She needed more evidence, more documentation, more pieces of the puzzle that would prove beyond doubt that William Tobias's land had been stolen and that she was its rightful heir. She spent the early hours photographing the mine entrance she'd found, using the disposable camera she'd bought in town. The old stonework was partially collapsed, overgrown with decades of vegetation, but the deliberate human construction was still visible to anyone who knew what to look for. She measured distances, sketched the layout, and marked the location precisely on a copy of William Tobias's survey map. Back at her shelter, she continued reading Vernon's journal more carefully, looking for anything she might have missed. And there, tucked between pages near the back, she found it a photograph, faded and creased, but still clear enough to make out the details. Two men stood in front of what was unmistakably a mine entrance. Both were dressed in work clothes from the early 20th century. One was tall and lean with a stern expression. The other was shorter, broader, with a calculating look in his eyes. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, William Tobias Winscombe and Augustus Drennick, 1917, Partnership Agreement. Thera stared at the photograph for a long time. Here was proof that the two men had worked together, that there had been a partnership, which meant the mine entrance she'd found was real, and whatever silver deposit William Tobias had discovered Augustus Drennick had known about it. She needed to understand more about what had happened between these two men, more about how the partnership had fallen apart. But who would remember stories from more than a century ago? The answer came to her as she was boiling water for coffee. Harvey Trent. Vernon's journal had mentioned him, the 89-year-old man at the hardware store who remembered his grandfather's stories about William Tobias's suspicious death. If anyone in Millstone still carried the old memories, it would be someone of Harvey's generation. Trent's Hardware was on Main Street, a narrow building sandwiched between the post office and the insurance office. The interior smelled of oil and sawdust, the shelves packed with tools and supplies in a layout that probably hadn't changed in 50 years. An elderly man sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper through thick glasses. "Mr. Trent." Thera approached carefully. "I'm Thera Winscombe, Vernon's widow." Harvey Trent looked up, and his weathered face softened with recognition. "I heard about Vernon. Good man. Made the best hinges in 3 counties." He folded his newspaper. "I also heard you've been living out in the woods and stirring up trouble with the Drennicks." Vernon was researching his family history before he died. "He came to talk to you about it." "He did. Wanted to know what my grandfather used to say about William Tobias Winscombe." Harvey gestured to a wooden stool. "Sit down. My feet hurt, and my memory's long. Might as well make use of both." Thera settled on the stool, and Harvey began to talk. His voice was rough but steady, the voice of a man who'd spent 9 decades watching his town change and remembering how things used to be. "My grandfather, Thomas Trent, he worked as a clerk at the assay office back in the mining days. That was 1,890 seconds through about 1,920. Small operation, just him and one other fellow, testing ore samples for the prospectors and miners working the hills. He knew everyone in the business, heard all the gossip." Harvey paused to adjust his glasses. "William Tobias Winscombe brought in samples in 1916. High-grade silver, according to my grandfather. Not the played-out veins most folks were finding, but something substantial. William Tobias was excited but cautious. He wanted to develop the claim properly, no rushing, no cutting corners." "And Augustus Drennick?" Thera prompted. There's the rub. Augustus was already established by then, had his timber business, had political connections, had money. William Tobias partnered with him because he needed capital to develop the mine properly. Augustus provided the money. William Tobias provided the claim and the mining knowledge. Should have been a good arrangement, but it wasn't. "No." Harvey's expression darkened. "My grandfather said Augustus got greedy. Wanted to file a corporate claim, push William Tobias out, take the whole operation for himself. William Tobias refused. They had a written agreement, 50-50 partnership, but Augustus had lawyers and influence and a willingness to bend rules. He started making William Tobias's life difficult, blocked access roads, got the county to question his property boundaries, spread rumors about the mine being played out. What happened in 1919? Thera asked quietly. Harvey was silent for a moment. William Tobias died. Fell from a ridge, they said. Found him at the bottom of a cliff about a mile from his property. County sheriff ruled it accidental, said he must have slipped in the dark, but my grandfather always said it was odd. William Tobias was an experienced surveyor, knew those hills like his own hands, and he'd been in town earlier that day, telling folks he was going to settle things with Augustus once and for all. Couple days later, he's dead. Week after that, Augustus Drennick claims the partnership had been dissolved, that he'd bought out William Tobias's share. Did he have documentation? Said he did. Private settlement, all legal and proper. But nobody ever saw William Tobias sign anything, and the original documents were kept in Drennick's private files. By the time William Tobias's son, that would be your husband's great-grandfather, was old enough to question it, the trail was cold. Augustus had covered his tracks well. Thera showed Harvey the photograph she'd found. His eyes widened slightly. Haven't seen this in 70 years. My grandfather had a copy, same photograph. Showed it to me once when I was a boy. Told me to remember that men who smile in photographs sometimes do terrible things when nobody's watching. Do you think Augustus Drennick killed William Tobias? Harvey met her eyes steadily. I think Augustus Drennick wanted something, and William Tobias stood in his way, and then William Tobias was conveniently dead. I think Augustus used his money and influence to bury the truth. And I think the Drennick family has been sitting on that land, or trying to ever since, waiting for the right moment to claim what William Tobias found. He tapped the photograph. You're digging into something dangerous, Mrs. Winscombe. The Drennicks don't like their family history examined too closely. Vernon was doing the same thing before he died. I know. Harvey's expression was sympathetic. Vernon came to see me about a month before his heart attack. Asked the same questions you're asking. I told him what I'm telling you. Be careful. The Drennicks have been powerful in this county for a long time. They have friends in the right places. Vernon went to confront them, Thera said. The day before he died, Harvey nodded slowly, and the next day his heart gave out. Could be coincidence, or could be that sometimes stress and confrontation are enough to kill a man with a weak heart. Or, he paused, or could be that some families have learned ways to make problems disappear that look natural. The most implication hung in the air between them. Thera wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, as conspiracy thinking, but she couldn't shake the pattern. William Tobias dies after confronting Augustus. Vernon dies after confronting Victoria. Both deaths ruled natural, both conveniently timed to silence men who were asking dangerous questions. What should I do? Thera asked. Document everything, Harvey said firmly. Make copies. Leave them with people you trust. Make sure that if something happens to you, the truth doesn't die with you. And get yourself protection, not just legal protection, but people who know what you're doing and will raise hell if you suddenly have an accident. Thera thanked him and left the hardware store with her mind churning. She stopped at the library, where Phyllis helped her make multiple copies of all her documents, the photographs, the property records, Vernon's journal entries. They sealed one set in an envelope and gave it to Morris at the courthouse with instructions to keep it secure. Another set went to James Kemper. A third set Thera kept with her. That evening, Lucille visited the shelter again, bringing dinner and moral support. Thera told her everything, the photograph, Harvey's stories, the disturbing pattern of convenient deaths. Lucille listened with growing alarm. You think they killed Vernon? I don't know, Thera said honestly. His doctor was clear that his heart disease was severe. He could have died any time. But the timing stinks, Lucille finished. She was quiet for a moment. If you're right, if there's even a chance you're right, then you're in real danger, Thera. These aren't people who play fair. I know, but I can't walk away. Not now. Vernon spent the last years of his life trying to uncover this truth. William Tobias died, was killed, trying to protect his claim. If I walk away, they win. They get away with murder. They get away with theft, and the lie continues for another generation. Then we make sure you don't face this alone, Lucille said firmly. I'll check on you daily. If I don't hear from you, I'm calling the sheriff. We'll set up a system. You come to my house every evening, or I come here. No exceptions. That way, if something happens, someone will know immediately. It was a sensible precaution, and Thera agreed gratefully. She wasn't naive enough to think she could fight the Drennicks entirely on her own. She needed allies, needed witnesses, needed people who would notice if she suddenly disappeared or had an accident. That night, after Lucille left, Thera sat by her fire and studied William Tobias's compass. The engraving on the inside, "Find True North," felt like more than just a navigation instruction. It felt like a moral compass, a reminder to stay true to what was right even when the path was dangerous. Vernon had tried to follow that compass. He'd tried to reclaim his family's stolen legacy, and whether his death was natural or not, Thera owed it to him to finish what he'd started. She would find true north, she would uncover the complete truth, and she would make sure that this time the Drennicks didn't get away with it. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Thera pulled her blanket tighter and felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders, not crushing, but strengthening. She was part of something larger now, a story that had begun over a century ago and was finally approaching its conclusion. Whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her resolve firm. The Drennicks had stolen once, they had killed to protect their theft. They would not be allowed to do it again. 3 days after her conversation with Harvey Trent, Thera decided it was time to properly examine the mine entrance. She'd photographed it, documented its location, but she hadn't actually tried to see what lay beyond the collapsed stonework. If she was going to prove that William Tobias had found valuable silver, she needed more than just historical accounts. She needed physical evidence. She packed Vernon's tools, a flashlight she'd bought in town, and some water. The walk to the mine entrance took 20 minutes, following the compass bearing north from her shelter. In the daylight, with purpose in her step, the route felt less mysterious and more like simple geography, a rocky outcropping on a hillside, partially hidden by mature trees. The entrance was more blocked than she'd initially thought. Decades of weathering had caused rocks to shift, and vegetation had grown thick over everything. But as Thera began carefully clearing away branches and smaller stones, she found something that made her hands still. Marks on the larger rocks, deliberate chisel work that suggested they'd been placed, not fallen naturally. Someone had sealed this mine, and they'd done it carefully, methodically, making it look like natural collapse while actually constructing a barrier. She worked for an hour, moving stones that weren't too heavy, cutting away vines and brush. The opening she revealed was narrow but passable, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond it, darkness. Thera hesitated at the entrance. She was 67 years old, alone in the woods, about to enter an abandoned mine that had been sealed for over a century. It was foolish, possibly dangerous, but she'd come this far, and the answers she needed were inside that darkness. She clicked on her flashlight and edged through the opening. The mine shaft was surprisingly stable. The walls were reinforced with timber supports that had held up remarkably well, protected from weather by the sealed entrance. The floor sloped downward gently, and Thera moved slowly, testing each step, keeping one hand on the wall for balance. About 30 feet in, the shaft opened into a small chamber. Her flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing something she hadn't expected, a workspace. There was a wooden table, rotted and collapsed. Metal tools rusted but still recognizable, pick, shovel, pry bar. And on the floor, covered in dust but unmistakable, a metal box. Thera's heart pounded as she knelt beside it. The box was locked, but the lock was old and corroded. She used one of Vernon's iron stakes to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly disintegrated, were papers. Her hands shook as she carefully unfolded them. The first was a geological survey report, dated 1916, commissioned by William Tobias Winscombe. She read it by flashlight, hardly daring to breathe. The survey confirmed a substantial silver vein running through the rock formation. The estimated yield was impressive, not a fortune by modern mining standards, but in 1916 it would have represented significant wealth. The report concluded that with proper development, the mine could produce valuable ore for years. The second document was a letter, and as Thera read it, the full story finally emerged. "My dearest son," it began, in William Tobias's careful handwriting. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I pray it was by God's will and not by man's hand. But I fear the latter, and so I write this account while I still can. Augustus Drennick and I began as partners in good faith. I found the silver, he provided capital to develop the claim. We signed an agreement, 50% ownership each, profits to be divided equally. The survey confirmed what I had hoped. This vein could provide for our families for generations. But Augustus grew impatient. He wanted to incorporate, to bring in outside investors, to expand operations quickly. I refused. This is Winscombe land, Winscombe silver. I wanted to keep it in family hands, develop it slowly and responsibly. Augustus did not take my refusal well. He began making trouble blocking access roads through his timberlands, filing complaints with the county about my claim boundaries, spreading word that the mine was played out when he knew it wasn't. I believe he means to force me out, to make me sell my half of the partnership for far less than it's worth. I will not sell. This land belongs to my family, and this silver belongs to my family. So I have made a decision. I am sealing the mine. I am hiding this survey report and a copy of our partnership agreement. And I am leaving this letter for you, so you will know the truth. If something happens to me, if I die under suspicious circumstances, know that Augustus Drennick is capable of violence in service of his greed. Do not trust him. Do not trust his family. Protect this claim, protect our land, and when the time is right, when you have the strength and resources to fight, reclaim what is ours. The law is supposed to protect property rights, but I have learned that law bends toward money and influence. Augustus has both. You may need to wait, to build your own strength, before you can challenge him. I have left you a compass, my father's compass, the one that guided me to this silver. Let it guide you to truth. Find true north, my son. Stay honest, stay strong, and know that what's mine stays mine. What I have claimed will someday return to Winscombe hands. With love and hope, William Tobias Winscombe, the 15th of March 1919, Thera had to stop reading halfway through because tears were blurring the words. William Tobias had known. He'd known Augustus planned to steal from him, probably kill him. And he'd sealed the mine, hidden the evidence, left a trail for his descendants to follow. But that trail had been lost for 4 generations. Vernon's grandfather never found this letter. Vernon himself had come close but died before he could complete the search. Now, finally, over a century later, Thera held the proof in her hands. There was more in the box. A copy of the partnership agreement, signed by both men, clearly stating 50-50 ownership. And beneath it, another document that made Thera's blood run cold. A bill of sale, dated April 1919, 1 month after William Tobias's letter, showing William Tobias supposedly selling his share of the partnership to Augustus Drennick for a pittance. But the signature was wrong. Thera had seen William Tobias's signature on other documents. Now the survey report, the letter, the partnership agreement. She wasn't a handwriting expert, but even to her eye, the signature on the bill of sale looked different, shakier, less confident, almost certainly forged. This was it. This was the evidence that would prove everything. William Tobias had predicted his own murder and documented the theft that would follow it. And he'd hidden that documentation in the one place Augustus couldn't access without revealing his own crime, inside the sealed mine that supposedly held nothing valuable. Thera carefully packed everything back into the metal box and made her way out of the mine. The sunlight seemed impossibly bright after the darkness, and she stood blinking for a moment, holding the box against her chest like a shield. She needed to get these documents to James Kemper immediately. They changed everything about her case. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was evidence of fraud, forgery, and quite possibly murder. The Drennicks' entire claim to this land was built on a crime, and now she could prove it. But as she started back toward her shelter, she heard something that made her freeze. Voices. Men's voices, coming from the direction of her camp. And then, unmistakably, the sound of wood splintering. Thera left the trail and moved quietly through the underbrush, approaching her shelter from the side. Through the trees, she could see 2 men, neither of them wearing Drennick timber uniforms, but she recognized the type. They were tearing apart her shelter, pulling away the canvas, knocking over her fire pit, searching through her few possessions, looking for exactly what she now held in. Her hands. One of the men called out, "Nothing here. She must have it with her." The other man's voice was harder. "Boss said to make sure. Check the ground, see if she buried anything." Thera backed away slowly, her heart hammering. They'd sent people to search her shelter, to find the evidence before she could use it, which meant someone had been watching her, had seen her go to the mine, and had sent these men while she was underground. She couldn't go back to the shelter. She couldn't risk them finding her with the documents. She needed to get to town, to safety, to James Kemper's office. But as she turned to leave, a branch cracked under her foot. Both men's heads snapped toward the sound. For a moment, everything was still. Then one of them shouted, "There! In the trees!" Thera ran. She clutched the metal box and ran through the forest, her 67-year-old legs pumping, her breath coming in gasps. Behind her, she could hear them crashing through the brush, following her trail. She knew these woods better than they did, but they were younger, faster, and there were two of them. She angled toward the logging road, toward town, toward people and witnesses and safety. Her lungs burned, her knees protested, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The box in her arms held a century of truth, and she would die before she let the Drennicks take it. A root caught her foot, and she stumbled, nearly fell, recovered. The voices behind her were closer. How close? Too close. Her legs were weakening, her pace slowing. She wasn't going to make it. She wasn't going to headlights. A vehicle on the logging road ahead. Coming toward her. Thera burst from the tree line directly into its path, waving her arms. The truck skidded to a stop, and Sheriff Dale Pritchard jumped out, his hand going to his weapon. "Thera? What's wrong?" "Men," she gasped, pointing behind her. "At my shelter. Searching. Chasing me." Dale's expression hardened. He grabbed his radio. "This is Sheriff Pritchard. I need backup at Ridge Creek Logging Road, possible assault in progress." Then to Thera, "Get in the truck. Now." She climbed into the passenger seat, still clutching the metal box. Dale moved to block the road, his hand on his gun. Moments later, the two men emerged from the forest. They stopped when they saw the sheriff, exchanged glances, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. Dale cursed and got back in the truck. "You all right?" "Yes." "No." "I don't know." Thera was shaking now, adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak. "They were tearing apart my shelter, looking for something." "What's in the box?" Thera met his eyes. "The truth. Everything I need to prove that Drennick stole my family's land and probably killed to cover it up." Dale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm taking you to the courthouse. You're going to give a statement, and we're going to put those documents somewhere secure. And then you're not going back to that shelter. It's not safe anymore. Where am I supposed to go? Lucille already said you could stay with her if needed. Or there's a motel in town. But you're not sleeping alone in the woods with people looking for you." He was right, and Thera knew it. The game had changed. The Drennicks had escalated from legal pressure to outright intimidation. She'd found the evidence that would destroy them, and they were desperate enough to try to stop her by force. The war was no longer theoretical. It had become very, very real. The county courthouse felt different at night. The marble hallways echoed with their footsteps as Sheriff Pritchard escorted Thera to his office. She still held the metal box, unwilling to let it out of her sight. Dale made bad coffee from a machine that looked like it had been there since the building opened, and they sat across from each other while she told him everything. The mine, the documents, William Tobias's letter predicting his own murder, the forged bill of sale, and finally, the men who'd been searching her shelter, who'd chased her through the woods. Dale took notes, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he said, "I need to see those documents." Thera opened the box and carefully laid everything on his desk. Dale read through each page slowly, his jaw tightening. When he reached William Tobias's letter, he sat back and rubbed his face. "This is way beyond property disputes," he said. "This is evidence of historical fraud and possibly murder. And if those men today were sent by the Drennicks, which seems likely they're trying to obstruct justice." He picked up his phone. "I need to call the state police. This is bigger than what my office can handle." While Dale made calls, Thera sat holding her coffee and feeling the weight of the past 24 hours settling on her. She'd woken that morning, planning to explore a mine. Now she was in the sheriff's office at 10 o'clock at night, with evidence of a century-old crime and fresh proof that powerful people would use force to keep their secrets buried. She thought about Vernon, about whether he'd felt this same combination of determination and fear. Had he known he was in danger? Had he suspected his investigation might cost him his life? 2 state police detectives arrived within the hour, a woman in her 40s named Lieutenant Marsh and a younger man named Detective Chen. They took formal statements, photographed the documents, and arranged for everything to be logged into evidence. The original documents would be kept in a secure facility. Copies would be provided to James Kemper for the civil case. "Mrs. Winscombe," Lieutenant Marsh said when they'd finished the paperwork, "you're going to need protection. Those men who searched your shelter and chased you, that's assault, trespassing, and intimidation of a witness. We'll be investigating, but in the meantime, you need to stay somewhere safe." "I'm staying with a friend in town," Thera said. "Lucille Brenner. She knows everything." "Good. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't return to the shelter site until we've completed our investigation. And if anyone approaches you or makes threats, call 911 immediately." Marsh handed her a card. "My direct number. Use it if you need it." It was nearly midnight when Sheriff Pritchard drove Thera to Lucille's house. Lucille met them at the door in her bathrobe, took one look at Thera's face, and pulled her into a hug without asking questions. Dale briefed her on what had happened, and Lucille's expression went from concerned to furious. "They sent men after her, actually chased her through the woods." She turned to Thera. "You're staying here. Your room's already made up. I had a feeling you'd need it eventually." Dale left, and Lucille made them both tea despite the late hour. They sat in her cozy kitchen, and Thera finally let herself feel the fear she'd been pushing down all evening. Her hands shook as she held the teacup. "I thought they were going to catch me," she said quietly. "I thought I wasn't going to make it." "But you did," Lucille said firmly. "You found the evidence, you got away, and now the authorities are involved. The Drennicks can't just make this disappear. They made it disappear once. They'll try again. Not this time. Too many people know now. The state police, Sheriff Dale, me, your lawyer, Morris at the courthouse. The truth is out there, Thera. They can't put it back in the box." Thera wanted to believe that, but she kept thinking about William Tobias's letter, about how he'd known the truth and documented it and died anyway, about how Vernon had followed the same path and ended up in a hospital bed, squeezing her hand and trying to tell her something important with his last coherent words. She slept fitfully that night in Lucille's guest room, waking several times from dreams of being chased through dark woods, of sealed mines and hidden documents, and men with hard voices saying the boss wanted it found. In the morning, James Kemper called. The state police had contacted him and provided copies of all the documents. His voice on the phone was energized, excited. "This changes everything, Thera. With William Tobias's letter and the forged bill of sale, we can prove fraud. We can invalidate any claim the Drennicks have made to that land over the past century. And if we can connect those men who chased you to the Drennick family, we have criminal charges on top of the civil case." "When's the hearing?" Thera asked. "Still scheduled for 4 weeks from now. But I'm filing an emergency motion to expedite based on the new evidence and the safety concerns. Judge Holbrook needs to see these documents as soon as possible." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Thera gave additional statements to the state police. James Kemper filed motions and prepared legal briefs. Morris at the courthouse worked with the state investigators to document the historical record manipulation. And slowly, inexorably, the full story began to emerge into public view. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Century-old land dispute reveals possible murder and fraud. It detailed William Tobias Winscombe's claim, his mysterious death, and the recent discovery of documents suggesting Augustus Drennick had forged ownership papers. The story was careful, legally cautious, but the implications were clear. Millstone hadn't seen this kind of scandal in decades. People took sides. Some defended the Drennicks. They were employers, benefactors, pillars of the community. Others remembered old grievances, old stories about the Drennick family's ruthless business practices. The fabric shop owner whose grandmother lost her farm, the retired teacher whose father had been forced to sell timber rights for below market value, the families who'd been pressured, threatened, or simply outlasted by Drennick money and influence. Thera became the center of it all, and she hated it. She'd never wanted attention or fame. She just wanted justice for Vernon and for William Tobias, and to protect what was rightfully hers. But now, she couldn't walk down Main Street without people stopping her, some to offer support, others to question her motives, still others to simply stare. Victoria Drennick made no public statements. Randall Drennick, through his lawyers, denied all accusations and characterized the situation as a sad case of a grieving widow being manipulated by opportunistic attorneys. Their PR strategy was clear: paint Thera as mentally unstable, the documents as questionable, the whole situation as a money grab. But the evidence was too solid, and James Kemper was too skilled. He held a press conference presenting the authenticated documents, the geological survey, and the timeline showing systematic record destruction. He pointed out that the Drennicks had never been able to produce clear title to the disputed 40 acres because they'd never legally owned it. "This isn't about money," Kemper said to the assembled reporters. "This is about a woman whose husband spent his final years trying to reclaim his family's stolen property. This is about a mining claim that was taken through fraud and violence over a century ago. And this is about finally delivering justice, no matter how long it takes." The hearing date was moved up. Judge Holbrook agreed to an expedited schedule given the criminal investigation and the safety concerns. The new date was set for 2 weeks out, barely enough time to prepare, but Kemper said they were ready. "The Drennicks will throw everything at us," he warned Thera during a preparation session at his office. "They'll challenge document authenticity, question the chain of custody, argue that even if fraud occurred a century ago, too much time has passed for remediation. They'll make this ugly. Let them," Thera said. She was tired of being afraid, tired of hiding. "I have the truth. That has to count for something." The days before the hearing were tense. Thera stayed at Lucille's house, rarely going out except for necessary meetings with Kemper or the state police. She learned that the 2 men who'd chased her had been identified through traffic cameras near the logging road. They were private contractors with a history of work for Drennick timber, plausible deniability, but damning nonetheless. Both men had lawyers now and weren't talking, but their presence on her property and pursuit of her was documented. Phyllis came to visit, bringing books and gentle conversation. Harvey Trent sent a message through his grandson. "Tell Mrs. Winscombe my grandfather would be proud." About time someone stood up to them. Morris stopped by with copies of additional historical records he'd found that supported Thera's case. The community was rallying, not universally, but enough to matter. People remembered their own struggles with the Drennick family, their own suspicions about how the wealthiest family in the county had acquired so much land. Thera's fight was becoming their fight, a proxy battle against a power structure that had dominated Millstone for too long. Vernon's pocket watch sat on the nightstand in her borrowed room. Thera wound it every night, listening to its steady tick. She imagined Vernon beside her, encouraging her, telling her she was doing the right thing. Sometimes she talked to him in the quiet hours, telling him about the day's developments, asking his advice, feeling his presence in the way that grief allows, not real, not physical, but comforting nonetheless. 3 days before the hearing, James Kemper received word that the Drennick family wanted to settle. They offered $500,000 and an acknowledgement that ownership of the 40 acres was in dispute, though without admission of historical wrongdoing. "It's a substantial offer," Kemper told Thera, "life-changing money, and it would end this now without the stress of a trial." Thera didn't hesitate. "No, this isn't about money. It's about the truth." William Tobias wrote that letter because he wanted his family to know what happened. Vernon spent years researching because he wanted justice. "I'm not settling for hush money that lets the Drennicks pretend none of this happened." "That's what I told them you'd say," Kemper replied with a slight smile. "But I had to present the offer. Now we go to trial, and we win this the right way." The night before the hearing, Thera couldn't sleep. She sat in Lucille's kitchen at 2 in the morning, drinking tea and reviewing her testimony. Tomorrow she would stand in front of a judge and tell the story of William Tobias Winscombe, of Augustus Drennick's fraud and probable murder, of Vernon's determined investigation, and her own unexpected journey from grieving widow to accidental detective. Tomorrow she would finish what 4 generations of her family had started, and, whatever the outcome, she would know that she'd fought for the truth with everything she had. She touched William Tobias's compass, which she planned to wear on a chain tomorrow as a reminder of why this mattered. Find true north. Stay honest, stay strong, and know that what's mine stays mine. Tomorrow she would find out if justice could reach back across a century and finally deliver what had been stolen so long ago. Tomorrow the Drennicks would answer for their family's crimes. And tomorrow, Thera would discover whether one determined woman with the truth on her side could overcome money, influence, and a system designed to protect the powerful. She was ready. Frightened, exhausted, but ready. The truth was on her side. It had to be enough. The county courthouse was packed. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, and people lined the walls where the bailiffs allowed standing room. Thera had never seen this kind of turnout for a civil hearing, but this case had captured Millstone's attention like nothing in recent memory. This was about more than property rights. It was about power, justice, and whether the truth could overcome decades of carefully maintained lies. Thera sat at the plaintiff's table beside James Kemper, wearing her best dress and William Tobias's pocket watch on a silver chain around her neck. The watch had stopped at 3:47, the time of William Tobias's death, according to family legend. She wore it as a reminder and a promise. This ends today. Across the aisle, the Drennick family occupied the defense table with 3 high-priced attorneys from the state capital. Randall Drennick sat rigid and angry, his jaw tight. Victoria Drennick, to Thera's surprise, looked older than she had before, diminished somehow, as if the weight of her family's history was finally showing on her face. Judge Patricia Holbrook entered, and everyone rose. She was known for being thorough, fair, and intolerant of theatrics. This hearing would be decided on evidence and law, not emotion or spectacle. "This is a property claim dispute with allegations of historical fraud," Judge Holbrook began, reviewing her notes. "Mrs. Winscombe claims rightful ownership of 40 acres, based on an 1,891 land patent granted to William Tobias Winscombe. The defendants argue the property was legally transferred to the Drennick family through a settlement in 1919. We're here to examine the evidence and determine rightful ownership. Mr. Kemper, you may proceed." James Kemper stood and approached the bench with calm confidence. "Your Honor, this case centers on a simple fact. William Tobias Winscombe legally owned 40 acres of land, and that land was stolen through fraud and possibly through murder. We have documentation proving both the original ownership and the subsequent theft." He presented the evidence methodically. The original land patent, unimpeachable federal documentation. The continuous ownership records through 1918, the mysterious gap where records disappeared. the pattern of surrounding properties being acquired by Drennick timber, creating a situation where the Winscombe claim was landlocked and theoretically worthless. Then came the documents from the mine. William Tobias's letter, the geological survey showing significant silver deposits, the partnership agreement between William Tobias and Augustus Drennick. The courtroom was silent as Kemper read portions of William Tobias's letter aloud. "If something happens to me, if I die under suspicious circumstances, know that Augustus Drennick is capable of violence in service of his greed." Kemper's voice carried through the room. This letter was written in March 1919. 1 month later, William Tobias Winscombe fell to his death from a cliff. His death was ruled accidental, but given what we now know about the valuable silver claim and Augustus Drennick's efforts to seize control, the timing is damning. The Drennick attorneys objected speculation, prejudicial, inadmissible character evidence. Judge Holbrook sustained some objections, but allowed the letter itself to be entered as evidence, noting that it went to the state of mind of the property owner and his concerns about fraud. Kemper then presented the forged bill of sale, the document Augustus Drennick had used to claim ownership after William Tobias's death. "Your Honor, we've had this document examined by forensic document experts. The paper stock, the ink composition, and most importantly the signature, do not match authenticated samples from 1919. This document was created later, likely decades later, as retroactive justification for the theft of William Tobias's property." The Drennick attorneys pushed back hard. Their expert witness testified that document aging was imprecise, that signatures varied, that records from that era were often inconsistent. They argued that even if irregularities existed, too much time had passed for remediation. Property rights required certainty and finality. You couldn't undo transactions from a century ago based on disputed documents. The Drennick family has held this property in good faith for over 100 years. Their lead attorney argued. They've paid taxes, maintained it, operated businesses on surrounding lands. Mrs. Winscombe is asking this court to invalidate a century of established ownership based on documents found in an abandoned mine and unverifiable claims about events no living person witnessed. But Kemper was ready. The defendants claim good faith, but they've never been able to produce clear title. They can't show a legitimate chain of ownership because one doesn't exist. The original owner never sold. His heirs never relinquished their claim. The property was stolen through fraud, and the records were deliberately destroyed to hide that theft. The fact that the theft occurred long ago doesn't make it legal. It makes it a long-standing injustice that this court finally has the opportunity to correct. Judge Holbrook called for a recess, and the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Thera felt the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion of sitting still while her life's future was debated by lawyers and challenged by the family responsible for a century of lies. Lucille squeezed her hand from the row behind. "You're doing great. The judge is listening." But Thera knew the hardest part was still coming. After the recess, she would take the stand. She would tell her story not just about the documents and the property claim, but about Vernon, about grief, about a woman who'd lost everything and found purpose in fighting for justice. Her testimony would humanize the legal arguments, but it would also expose her to cross-examination, to attacks on her credibility, to the Drennick attorneys trying to paint her as unstable or opportunistic. She touched the pocket watch at her throat and thought of William Tobias, writing his letter by lamplight, knowing he might die for trying to protect his claim. She thought of Vernon, following the same trail of questions, trying to finish what his great-great-grandfather had started. And she thought of herself, a 67-year-old widow who'd gone into the woods to escape grief and found instead a purpose that would define the rest of her life. The bailiff called them back to order. Judge Holbrook returned to the bench, and James Kemper stood to call his next witness. The plaintiff calls Thera Winscombe to the stand. Thera rose, walked to the witness stand, and placed her hand on the Bible to swear her oath. She looked out at the packed courtroom, at the Drennicks glaring from their table, at Lucille and Phyllis and Morris offering encouraging smiles, at the reporters taking notes, at the townspeople who'd come to witness this reckoning, and she began to tell her story. James Kemper's direct examination was gentle, allowing Thera to tell her story in her own words. She spoke about Vernon, their 40-year marriage, his work as a blacksmith, the way he'd become increasingly interested in his family history during his final years. She described finding his journal after his death, the research notes and questions he documented, his determination to understand what had happened to William Tobias's land claim. "Vernon died trying to reclaim what had been stolen from his family," Thera said, her voice steady. "He spent the last years of his life following a trail of questions, and when he got close to the truth, he died. Whether his heart attack was purely natural, or whether the stress of confronting powerful people contributed to it, I'll never know. But I do know that he deserved to finish what he started. This case isn't just about property, it's about honoring my husband's memory and delivering justice that's a century overdue." She described her decision to live in the woods, finding the shelter site and discovering that she'd chosen the exact location of William Tobias's original claim. Her testimony painted a picture of a woman following her husband's footsteps without fully realizing it at first, drawn by some combination of grief and instinct to the place that mattered most. "When Randall Drennick offered me $50,000 to leave, I didn't understand why at first. It was too much money for what appeared to be worthless forest land. But then I started reading Vernon's research more carefully, and I began to understand. It wasn't about the land itself, it was about what lay beneath it, and about protecting a lie that had stood for over 100 years. The Drennick attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, as expected. They questioned her mental state after Vernon's death, suggested that her isolation in the woods showed poor judgment. They implied she was being manipulated by attorneys seeking a large settlement. They challenged her interpretations of Vernon's journal entries and questioned why she hadn't simply accepted the generous offers made by the Drennick family. But Thera held firm. She answered each question calmly, refusing to be rattled or defensive. When they suggested she was motivated by money, she said simply, "I've lived under a tree for 2 months with nothing but a rucksack and my husband's tools. Do I look like someone chasing wealth? I want justice. I want the truth acknowledged. The money, if it comes, is secondary." When they questioned the authenticity of documents found in an abandoned mine, she said, "William Tobias sealed that mine deliberately to protect these papers. He knew his claim would be stolen, and he left evidence for his descendants to find. Vernon spent years trying to find it. I succeeded where he couldn't. That doesn't make the evidence less valid, it makes it more precious." The attorneys pressed hard on the forged bill of sale, but then James Kemper recalled his forensic document expert, who presented detailed analysis showing the document couldn't have been created in 1919. The notary seal used a design that didn't exist until 1923. The paper stock contained chemical markers from post-1940 manufacturing processes. The signature, when compared to authenticated William Tobias samples, showed inconsistencies that suggested forgery. This document was created retroactively. The expert testified, likely in the 1,960 seconds or 70 seconds, to provide paper justification for ownership that had been claimed through other means decades earlier. The Drennick attorneys had no effective rebuttal. Their own expert could only say that the analysis was interesting but not conclusive, a weak response that did nothing to counter the physical evidence. Victoria Drennick took the stand in the afternoon, and the courtroom tension ratcheted higher. She was composed, elegant, and utterly unconvincing when she tried to explain the discrepancies in the ownership records. "My father-in-law's business dealings from the 1,910 seconds and 20 seconds were before my time," she said, carefully. "I can only speak to what I've been told, that there was a partnership between Augustus Drennick and William Tobias Winscombe, that it dissolved, and that my father-in-law acquired full ownership through a settlement. Do you have documentation of this settlement? Kemper asked. The original files were lost in the courthouse fire of 1923. Convenient. Kemper's tone was dry. And yet somehow documents establishing Drennick ownership of surrounding properties survived that same fire. Only the Winscombe settlement file was lost. Victoria had no answer that didn't sound defensive. When Kemper pressed her about the men who'd searched Thera's shelter and chased her through the woods, she insisted they weren't acting on Drennick family orders, but couldn't explain why contractors with a history of working for Drennick Timber would target Thera without direction. By late afternoon, all testimony was complete. Judge Holbrook called for closing arguments. The Drennick attorneys made their case for established ownership, for the impossibility of undoing century-old transactions, for the chaos that would result if property rights weren't considered final and binding regardless of how they were originally acquired. James Kemper's closing was powerful and direct. Your Honor, this case is about whether theft becomes legal if you get away with it long enough. William Tobias Winscombe owned that land. Augustus Drennick wanted it. William Tobias died under suspicious circumstances, and his property disappeared from the public record through fraud. The Drennick family has benefited from that theft for over a century. This court now has the opportunity to finally say, no more. Theft is theft, regardless of how long ago it occurred. Justice delayed is not justice denied if we're willing to deliver it now. Judge Holbrook was silent for a long moment, reviewing her notes. Then she said, I'm going to take this matter under advisement. Given the complexity of the evidence and the historical significance of this case, I want to review everything thoroughly before making my ruling. I'll issue my decision within 10 days. She struck her gavel, and the hearing was over. Thera stood on shaky legs, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. Lucille was there immediately, offering support. Phyllis and Morris approached with words of encouragement. James Kemper shook her hand and said, You did well. Very well. Now we wait. But Thera wasn't thinking about waiting. She was thinking about William Tobias, writing his letter in 1919, hoping that someday his descendants would read it and understand. She was thinking about Vernon, following clues and asking questions until the very end. And she was thinking about herself, a woman who'd gone into the woods to escape grief and emerged ready to fight for justice. Whatever Judge Holbrook decided, Thera had done everything she could. She'd told the truth. She'd honored Vernon's memory. She'd given William Tobias's story a voice after more than a century of silence. Now, finally, it was in the hands of the law. 8 days after the hearing, Thera received the call from James Kemper. Judge Holbrook had issued her ruling. They needed to be at the courthouse by 3 o'clock that afternoon for the formal announcement. The intervening week had been the longest of Thera's life. She'd stayed at Lucille's house, trying to occupy herself with reading and helping around the house, but her mind constantly returned to the courtroom, to Victoria Drennick's evasive testimony, to the weight of evidence they'd presented. Had it been enough? Would Judge Holbrook have the courage to overturn a century of accepted history? The courthouse was less crowded than it had been for the hearing, but the same key players were present. Thera sat beside James Kemper, her hands folded in her lap, William Tobias's pocket watch warm against her chest. Across the aisle, the Drennick family waited with their attorneys, Randall's face set in hard lines, Victoria's expression unreadable. Judge Holbrook entered, and everyone rose. She carried a thick document, her written ruling. She took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and began. This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented in the matter of Winscombe versus Drennick. This is an unusual case, dealing with events that occurred over a century ago and asking this court to revisit property ownership that has been accepted for generations. However, the law does not have a statute of limitations on fraud, and this court's duty is to determine rightful ownership based on legal documentation, not on how long an illegal situation has persisted. Thera's heart pounded as Judge Holbrook continued. The evidence is clear and compelling. William Tobias Winscombe held legal title to 40 acres through a federal land patent, dated 1891. Records show continuous ownership and tax payments through 1918. The claim that William Tobias sold or transferred this property to Augustus Drennick in 1919 is not supported by credible evidence. The bill of sale presented by the defendants has been shown through forensic analysis to be a forgery, created decades after the purported transaction. Furthermore, the systematic disappearance of relevant records from county files suggests deliberate destruction of evidence. Judge Holbrook looked up from her document, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. The court finds that William Tobias Winscombe's property was taken through fraud. The partnership agreement between William Tobias and Augustus Drennick regarding mineral rights does not constitute transfer of the land itself. William Tobias never legally relinquished his claim, and therefore his heirs maintain legal ownership. Thera felt tears prick her eyes. Vernon, William Tobias, a century of waiting. And finally, justice. This court recognizes Mrs. Thera Winscombe as the legal heir to William Tobias Winscombe's 40-acre claim. The property is hereby restored to Winscombe ownership. Any claims by the Drennick family to said property are null and void. Furthermore, this court is forwarding the evidence of document forgery to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal investigation. Judge Holbrook struck her gavel. Case decided in favor of the plaintiff. The courtroom erupted. Lucille grabbed Thera in a fierce hug. James Kemper shook her hand with genuine triumph in his eyes. Across the aisle, Randall Drennick stood abruptly and left without a word, his attorneys gathering papers and following. Victoria Drennick remained seated for a moment, and when her eyes met Thera's, there was something in her expression that might have been respect or resignation or simply exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Thera, asking for statements. She kept her words simple. This case was never about money. It was about truth and justice for my husband Vernon and his great-great-grandfather William Tobias. I'm grateful that Judge Holbrook had the courage to correct a century-old wrong. That's all I have to say. In the weeks that followed, the practical details of ownership were settled. The 40 acres were officially registered in Thera's name. A mining company expressed interest in leasing the mineral rights, and the geological survey confirmed substantial silver deposits, not a fortune by modern standards, but enough to provide comfortable income for the rest of Thera's life. Thera negotiated a careful lease agreement that protected the land itself while allowing limited mineral extraction. She used part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Vernon's name for local students interested in historical preservation and justice studies. Another portion went to funding a community center, and she set aside money to help families fighting their own property disputes against powerful interests. The Drennick family's reputation in Millstone never fully recovered. Randall quietly stepped back from community leadership roles. Victoria Drennick sold the family's hilltop mansion and moved to the state capital. Drennick Timber continued operations, but under new management and with a much lower profile. 3 months after the ruling, Thera returned to her shelter under the fallen oak. The site had been secured during the investigation, and now it was legally, unquestionably hers. She'd made improvements: proper doors and windows, better insulation, a small solar panel for electricity. But she'd kept the essential character of the place, a shelter built by hand, a refuge carved from grief and determination. She could have bought a house in town. She could have lived anywhere, but this place meant something now. It was where she'd found herself after losing Vernon. It was where she'd discovered William Tobias's hidden truth. It was where 4 generations of Winscombe history had finally come full circle. She sat by her fire pit one evening in late autumn, watching smoke curl up through the root system of the fallen oak. The woods were settling into winter, and she'd made preparations, more firewood stacked, supplies stored, the shelter winterized. She wasn't lonely. Lucille visited weekly, bringing news and companionship. Phyllis sent books. Morris stopped by occasionally with county records. He thought she'd find interesting. They'd become friends through the case, bonded by their shared fight against institutional injustice. Vernon's journal lay open on her lap, and Thera ran her fingers over his handwriting. She could almost hear his voice reading the words, telling her the stories of William Tobias, explaining his research and his questions. He would have been so happy to see this ending, to know that his work had mattered, that justice had finally been delivered. "We did it," she said softly to the evening air, to Vernon's memory, to William Tobias's spirit that seemed to linger in these woods. "We finished what you started. The land is ours again. The truth is known. They didn't get away with it." The pocket watch rested against her chest, no longer a symbol of death, but of perseverance. William Tobias had declared, "What's mine stays mine," and he'd been right. It had taken 4 generations, but the Winscombe claim had been reclaimed. The stolen property had been returned. The forged documents had been exposed, and a family's legacy had been restored. Thera Winscombe was 67 years old. She'd buried her husband, lost her old life, lived under a tree, fought the most powerful family in the county, and won. She'd found purpose in grief, strength in adversity, and justice in persistence. Her story would be told in Millstone for generations, the widow who wouldn't yield, who followed her husband's trail of questions into the past, and emerged with truth that could not be denied. As darkness settled over the woods, Thera built up her fire and watched the flames dance. She was home not in the house she'd shared with Vernon, but in this place she'd claimed for herself, on land that had always belonged to her family. The fallen oak sheltered her, its roots a cathedral of wood and earth. The forest surrounded her with its ancient rhythms. And somewhere, she felt certain, Vernon smiled. Some journeys begin with endings. Thera's had started with Vernon's death and her retreat into grief. But it had become something larger, a quest for justice that reached across time, a fight that honored the past while building a better future. A story about how one person's determination can finally deliver what's right, no matter how long the wrong has persisted. The fire crackled. The night deepened. And Thera Winscombe sat content in the shelter she'd built, on the land she'd reclaimed, with the truth finally told and justice finally served. She had found more than property in these woods. She had found herself, her purpose, and proof that some battles are worth fighting no matter the odds. What's mine stays mine. What was stolen has been returned. And sometimes, if you're willing to stand firm and speak the truth, even a century-old wrong can finally be made right.